Hi guys, how are you all doing? Welcome back to my channel once again. Today's video is going to be a continuation on my last video in which I discussed about .NET Web API. In this video, I am going to cover adding the support for Entity Framework Core and separating my API project with the DAL project. I'm also going to separate the data transfer objects with the Entity Framework classes and look at taking care of exception handling. So let's get started. So the first thing that I have done in my project is created a new solution file called car finder, and you can do that in VS Code by doing .NET new SLN and then specifying the file name. Because I'm already in a folder called car finder, it will actually create a solution file for me called carfinder.sln. And the next important thing that I have done is making sure that I install an extension called VS Code Solution Explorer. I already have it installed with me over here, and what that allows me to do is if I click on that, it will help me visualize the solution that I have. And I have created two separate projects, one which will look after taking care of the API layer and the other one which will look after the data access layer. And if I expand those projects, I can easily check the contents, and I can also look at the references and the packages that are there. So we'll first have a look at the DAL project. And within this project, I have created a data access folder. Within data access, I have the DB context. And within DB context, I have defined the car context class and the car context factory. And then within the entities folder, I have all the entities that are defined. So in the car context, I have created the car context which inherits from the DB context. And this defines a DB set, which is of the type cars, which returns a set of cars. And the car context factory allows me to create a new DB context, and it references to some configuration which I can load from my app settings.json properties file. And from there, I can load my default connection string that I can use to connect to my database. This is needed to allow me to run my DAL project independently, because now I have that segregation between the API and the DAL project. And within the entities folder, I have defined all my entity classes which represents my database. So I have the body type enumerator, the cars entity, engine, and transmission. And underneath there, I have the migrations folder. Now this gets created when I do the entity framework migrations, which I'll talk about in a bit later. Now let's have a look at the changes that I have done within my API project. So in my car controller class, I have actually added an exception handling for my delete car request. When there is an HTTP delete request that comes in, which provides the ID of the car to be deleted, I am first going into my service and attempting to delete a car. And if I have a look at the implementation for that, what I do is I find in my car context, I find the car that is there for that particular ID. And if I can find something, then it will return me that car object. If that object is not null, then I remove it and then I save changes using the entity framework and return the ID. But if the object returns a null, then I just simply return a null. And back in my controller class, if that returns a null, then I actually log an error. So I say that that particular car with that ID not found, and I return a not found status with some error details. So this particular method also produces a response type of 404 not found, and that's where I am returning not found. And I have defined the error details object under my model class, and this object contains a status code and an error message. And under the exceptions folder, we are creating a new static class called exception factory, which we will use for handling our exceptions. We create the configure exception handler method with the iApplication builder and the iLogger parameters. And we register the use exception handler middleware. By using the run method of the app error object, we registered the context object. And then we populate the status code and the content type of the context or response object. And then we extract the context feature object from the context object by using the iException handler feature interface. And if the context feature is not null, then we log an error. Something went wrong, context feature.error. And finally, we return the response with the custom created error details object. And we populate the status code and the error message. And to use the exception handler, we change the configure method of our startup class to configure the exception handler. So once all of this is in place, our exception handling will start to work. And if I run my project and then go back to my Swagger, I can then attempt to make a delete request with some ID that I'm sure I know that it doesn't exist. So let me give an ID of 200. And if I execute that request, I can see that it's returning my error response with the status code and error message. So the next thing that we will look at is our models folder. And under the models folder, I have declared a few DTO objects. So we have car DTO, which represents the data represented by a car. Then we have the engine DTO, which represents our engine. Now, I'd like to talk a bit about why I have separated my entity objects and DTO objects and why I think it's a good practice to do so. I would have the separation of concerns because my cars.dal project is separate and the API project is separate, and maintaining the DTOs and models over here and the entities separately in the DAL project will allow me to have that separation of concerns. Also in my entities, I would actually have all these annotations, for example, the column type and the size for in my entity objects. And I don't want to bring that information back into my API layer. So that separation will allow me to do that. And another reason could be that in my entities, I would want to maintain a certain relationship between the objects, but that could not be the case. That may not be the case in my DTO objects. And in my DTO objects, I might want to represent it in a bit different way, in the way how I want the UI to consume it. So that could be the other concern. Now let's go ahead and see how we can create the entity framework migrations. So I have already done the entity framework migrations previously, and that's why it has created this migrations folder. But what I'm going to do for this exercise is get rid of this folder, and I'll do my migrations from the beginning so that you can see and understand how it actually goes about creating my migrations. So let me delete the migrations folder first. And I have also ensured that my localhost SQL Server database does not have the cars database any longer. So I have dropped that database. So we're going to create it from scratch. So first thing that you need to ensure is that your .NET Entity Framework is installed, and you can run this command to install that. For me, it's already installed. And you can verify the .NET Entity Framework version by just doing .NET EF. And I have the version 5.0.4. Okay, so first to create the entity framework migrations, I need to run the command .NET EF migrations add and then the name of my migrations. So it could be any name. So let me copy and paste this command. And just note that I'm running these commands under my DAL project. And I'll name my migration as initial create. Okay, so it says build started and build succeeded. And once it's done that, what it has basically done is created my migrations folder over here. So I deleted this earlier, but it has recreated that folder again. And the last thing that I should do is make sure that my database is updated. So for that, I need to run the .NET EF database update command. I'll just fix that first. It should be .NET. So let's copy that command and paste it here. And this is doing is it's connecting to the database and then updating the database with the table structure that I need. So I have an error over here. So let's have a look. Okay, so the connection string that I'm using to connect to my database doesn't seem to be correct. So I need to fix that first. So I have opened the app settings.json file, which is under my DAL project, and I need to update this connection string so that I can connect to my local database. So I'll update the connection string and change it with my connection string to connect to my local database. So I'm connecting to the local host on port 1433 and the database is cars. And at the moment, the user ID password is hard coded over here, which is quite insecure and you shouldn't be doing that. But for the moment, I'll just want it to run this. And let's run that command again, .NET EF database update. Okay, so it says build started and then build succeeded and applying migrations initial create. So if I now go back into my localhost database, I should be able to see the new database appearing here. So if I just refresh this, I can see the cars database is over there now. And I can look at the tables that it has created. So there is a cars table and it has the schema that I created in my entity table. Make, model, years, doors, body type and transmission. So if in the future I continue developing and doing more changes to my entities, I'll need to recreate my migrations and also update the database. So that will bring the database in line with whatever entities I have in my project. So with that, we complete today's video. I hope you have found this useful and thanks a lot for watching.